HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Pursuit of Power, Europe, 1815 to 1914, by Richard J. Evans, read by Napoleon Ryan. Preface. This book is a history of Europe from 1815 to 1914, following on sequentially in the Penguin History of Europe from the previous volume in the series, The Pursuit of Glory, 2007, which covers the period 1648 to 1815. As the author of that brilliant book, my Cambridge colleague Tim Blanning remarks, every history of Europe has to start at some arbitrary date, but some dates are more arbitrary than others. We speak habitually of the 19th century or the 20th century, but historians know that the period 1801 to 1900 or 1901 to 2000 has no real meaning beyond the merely chronological. History is full of loose ends, and even the outbreak and conclusion of major wars that so often provide the terminal dates for histories covering discrete segments of the European past, including this one, leave many issues unresolved. Different aspects of history have different chronologies, and a date that has a meaning in political or military or diplomatic history may have very little significance in social or economic or cultural history. French historians of the Annales school have become accustomed to speaking of an immobile history, which persisted well into modern times in many parts of Europe, so that, despite the fall of the Ancien Régime in European political systems at the end of the 18th century, the Ancien Régime économique et social persisted well into the second half of the 19th century. It took until this point, for example, for serfdom to disappear from the scene in most of Europe, while the long-established demographic pattern of high birth rates and high death rates did not begin to change, except in France, until the so-called demographic transition of the decades after 1850. On the other hand, industrialization was a marginal process, confined to small pockets of the European economy until the same period. Some historians, indeed, notably Arno Meyer in his book The Persistence of the Ancien Régime, 1981, have argued that the dominance of traditional aristocratic elites remained all the way up to the First World War, so that not much of significance changed in the political sphere either, despite all the surface turmoil of the era. But Meyer's view has not been widely accepted by historians. Change there certainly was in 19th century Europe, not just in politics, but in other spheres of life as well. Some, indeed, have decided that the most meaningful period to study is the Age of Revolution, to quote the title of the first volume of Eric Hobsbawm's survey of the years 1789 to 1914, published in 1962. Hobsbawm's periodization was followed by Jonathan Sperber in his Revolutionary Europe, 2000, covering the years 1789 to 1848, the same period as Hobsbawm's first volume. Yet there is a price to pay for choosing these years, for what came after was a very different Europe, one much less easy to conceptualize in a single framework. Not by chance, Sperber's follow-up volume has a wordy title that conveys, no doubt unconsciously, the difficulty he encountered in finding a unifying theme. Europe, 1850 to 1914, Progress, Participation, and Apprehension, 2008. Hobsbawm went on to write two more volumes, The Age of Capital, 1975, covering the years 1848 to 1875, and The Age of Empire, 1987, taking the story up to the First World War. Anyone who attempts to write a history of 19th century Europe has to confront these three magnificent books, which tower over the literature on the period. And, with his uncanny gift for conceptual innovation, Hobsbawm went on to characterize the whole period covered by his trilogy as the long 19th century, a model followed by many textbooks and primers. For example, William Simpson and Martin Jones's Europe, 1783 to 1914, 2000. The long 19th century is, however, a broken-backed century, divided into two very different halves by the 1848 revolutions. Not surprisingly, like Sperber, many historians covering the period from the French Revolution or the defeat of Napoleon to the First World War have given up the attempt to find any kind of conceptual unity and have chosen anodyne titles such as Europe's Uncertain Path, 2012, to quote R.S. Alexander's recent political narrative. Through most of the 20th century, historians regarded the rise of nation-states and the conflicts between them as the central features of European history in the 19th century. The triumph of nationalism forged new political and cultural entities and inspired revolts against large and, it seemed, outmoded multinational empires, revolts against oppression by other nationalities, or ambitions to achieve dominance over them. This model of the nation-state was exported across the globe in the 20th century, making its emergence in Europe in the 19th seem even more important. Historians once saw this process in positive terms, putting celebratory accounts of the unification of Italy and Germany, the growth of Czech and Polish national consciousness, and other products of the age of nationalism at the center of their narrative. As national and ethnic rivalries spilled over into the vast conflagration of the Second World War, however, the rise of nationalism appeared in a darker light, a view underlined by the Balkan Wars of the 1990s. But since then, we have come increasingly to live in an age of globalization. As the barriers created by the Cold War have crumbled, international institutions, worldwide means of communication, multinational companies, and many other influences have eroded national boundaries and begun to bind us all together as a global human community. Since the turn of the century, this has also altered our vision of the past, which historians have come to see increasingly in a global perspective. The call for the writing of global history is not in itself new. It was issued as long ago as the 1970s by the French historian Marc Ferro, and was present in the concept of Universalgeschichte, universal history, as practiced by Leopold von Ranke in the 19th century, or Arnold Toynbee and William H. McNeill in the 20th. But a global history that links the different parts of the world, rather than telling their discrete stories, has emerged only recently, as historians have begun to examine subjects such as the effects of empire on European economies, societies, cultures, and political systems, notably, but not exclusively those of Britain. The global economic ties that bound Europe to other parts of the world in a nexus of mutual interaction, and the rise of worldwide empire as a common European process, rather than one specific to any particular European nation. Historians have also been busy rewriting the history of individual European nations in a global context, emphasizing the effects of European diasporas, the millions of Europeans who emigrated to other parts of the globe, on the mother country, the infusion of European nationalism with elements of racial theory derived from the experience of colonization in Africa or Asia, and the emergence of global geopolitics as a key factor in relations between European states. A particular influence on my own approach here has been exerted by the German historian Jürgen Osterhammel, whose The Transformation of the World, A Global History of the 19th Century, 2009, is indeed a truly global history, not a Eurocentric one, such as Hobsbawm's trilogy. Covering the 19th century, his chapters deal with an astonishing variety of topics, including memory and self-observation, time, space, mobility, living standards, cities, frontiers, power, revolution, the state, energy, work, communications, hierarchies, knowledge, civilization, religion, and many more. Osterhammel deliberately picks out common themes, connections between different parts of the globe, shared developments, and global processes. Yet the author's argumentative and reflective presence generally eclipses that of the people who lived in the era about which he is writing. Often, too, historical surveys spend all their time establishing the broad contours of interpretation without attempting to convey how they could be discerned in the lives and experiences of contemporaries. This is perhaps understandable in a brief textbook, whose ultimate purpose is to prepare students for examinations. But a more extensive work, such as the present one, aimed in the first place at the general listener, fortunately has the space to provide the detail that conveys the flavor of the period, in its mixture of strangeness and familiarity, and as far as possible to allow contemporaries to speak for themselves. Other, no less ambitious works of global history, written around the same time as Osterhamel's, have offered a rather different approach to the 19th century, based on the perception that this was the period above all others when Europe led the world and came to exercise dominion over other parts of the globe. Historians like the late Chris Bailey, in his impressive The Birth of the Modern World, 2004, and John Darwin, in his masterly survey of global empires, After Tamerlane, 2007, have established, with a wealth of comparative evidence, the approximate equality in almost every respect, from living standards to cultural achievements, of a whole range of civilizations across the world in the early 18th century. The Mughal Empire in India, the Qing Empire in China, the great pre-colonial empires of Benin and its neighbors in Africa, the Ottoman Empire, and other states were roughly on a par with Europe around 1700. By 1815, this was no longer the case. Europe had forged ahead, not, as some historians, notably Niall Ferguson in his sweeping survey of civilization, 2011, have maintained, because of its intrinsic superiority, but because of quite specific historical circumstances. Europe maintained and extended its advantage on many fronts right up to the early years of the 20th century, though by then, as we shall see, that advantage was increasingly coming under attack. The First World War called it into question. The Second World War destroyed it, bringing down the global European empires in its aftermath. This global hegemony is the main justification for taking the years 1815 to 1914 as a distinct and meaningful period of European history. Throughout this book, the global context will be repeatedly emphasized, and events and processes on other continents will be brought into the narrative as a way of helping to explain what was happening in Europe during these decades. Global history also means transnational history. Many histories of Europe have consisted of largely separate narratives of different national histories. Arthur Grant and Harold Temperley's Europe in the 19th Century, 1927, falls into this category. William Simpson and Martin Jones's Europe, 1783 to 1914, is in the same mold, with separate chapters on France, Germany, Italy, Russia, and the Habsburg Empire. The German historian Michael Zalewski's History of Europe, 2000, is subtitled States and Nations from the Ancient World to the Present, and presents a series of histories of its individual countries and the relations between them. This means that the reader largely loses sight of what, if anything, bound Europe together as a whole, what these countries had in common, or what wider processes affected them. The long-established and still incomplete Oxford History of Modern Europe takes a similar approach, with every volume devoted to a single country, except for the 4 volumes that cover the relations between them over different periods. And yet, as well as being an evolving assemblage of individual states, Europe, as this book hopes to demonstrate, also had a definable existence as a collective entity. This was not, as a geographical area. Europe's eastern boundaries in particular were vague and hard to define, and Europe's social and cultural limits became blurred in the course of mass emigration to other parts of the world. Rather, with these provisos, Europe is best seen as a social, economic, political, and cultural region, sharing many common characteristics and stretching from Britain and Ireland in the west to Russia and the Balkans in the east. In taking an approach that as far as possible is transnational, I am consciously following in the footsteps of Lord Acton, the founder of the Cambridge Modern History at the end of the 19th century. In his plan for this ambitious enterprise, Acton told his contributors that universal history is not the sum of all particular histories, and ought to be contemplated first in its distinctive essence, as Renaissance, Reformation, religious wars, absolute monarchy, revolution, etc. The several countries may or may not contribute to feed the mainstream, but attention ought not to be dispersed by putting Portugal, Transylvania, Iceland side by side with France and Germany. My plan is to break through the mere juxtaposition of national histories and to take in, as far as may be, what is extraterritorial and universal. In the event, Acton died before he could realize this ambitious project, and when it was eventually published under the more efficient but less imaginative editorship of Sir Adolphus Ward, the Cambridge Modern History did indeed largely adopt a country-by-country approach, reflecting very much the nation-based vision of a younger generation of historians in the changed political and cultural atmosphere of the Europe they inhabited. It was only with the fall of communism, the extension of the European Union to much of Eastern Europe, and the renewed onward march of globalization, that the possibility of writing a real European history re-emerged. It is no longer possible to equate it, however, as Grant and Temperley and their counterparts elsewhere tried to do, with the history of national politics and international relations. Since the 1970s at the latest, historical investigation has expanded its field of vision until it encompasses almost every aspect of human activity in the past. Already, in the early 1960s, Hobsbawm's Age of Revolution contained chapters on religion, ideology, science, the arts, the economy, and much else besides. Subsequently, historical research has extended its range even further, as Osterhamel's list of topics suggests, most recently into the history of landscape and environment. Hobsbawm was able to bind his themes together through an overarching master narrative that placed the development and determining influence of capitalism at its core. But the historians of the early 21st century, a time when grand master narratives have fallen into disrepute, can no longer enjoy this advantage. The most we can do, as Tim Blanning says, is to trace lines of development. Two of the main lines of development Blanning identifies for the years 1648 to 1815, what he calls the relentless march of the state to hegemony, and the emergence of a new kind of cultural space, the public sphere, continued through the 19th century. They achieved an expansion and a dominance that were almost unthinkable in the 18th century. The state structures of the Restoration Europe that emerged in 1815 would in some respects still have been familiar to the continent's inhabitants of 30 years before, even though appearances in many ways were deceptive. The power and intrusiveness of the state was still relatively limited. Popular participation in politics was still minimal, despite the recent, vivid example of the events of the French Revolution. The public sphere was still confined mostly to a small stratum of the educated and the literate and their institutions, from the periodical publication to the coffee house or the reading club. But by 1914, the state had been transformed. On the one hand, there was universal male, and in some parts of the continent, even female suffrage, and direct popular participation in the shaping of national, regional, and local policy, not least through organized political parties. On the other hand, there was a vast expansion in the control that the state could exercise over its citizens in areas ranging from education to health, military service, to social work. The linked processes of the improvement of communications and the growth of the economy, delineated by Blanning, accelerated faster in the 19th century than anyone in the 18th century could have imagined. In 1815, the railway, the telegraph, the steamship, and the photograph were barely visible over the historical horizon. By 1914, Europe was entering the age of the telephone, the motor car, radio, and cinema. In 1815, we are still in the age of the Newtonian understanding of the universe, of representational art and classical music. By 1914, Einstein had propounded his theory of relativity, Picasso had painted his Cubist works, Schoenberg had composed his first atonal pieces. Europe was also, in an even more immediate sense, entering the age of the machine gun, the tank, the submarine, and the fighter plane. The first aerial bombardment of an enemy was recorded in 1911 during the Italian invasion of Libya, and the first European concentration camps were opened in South Africa by the British and in Southwest Africa, Namibia, by the Germans. Such developments, foreshadowing the immense violence and destructiveness of the first half of the 20th century, stand as a warning against treating the 19th century, as most of its inhabitants treated it, as an age of linear progress and open-ended improvement. Progress had its price, and in the succeeding period, between 1914 and 1949, as Ian Kershaw shows in To Hell and Back, the next volume in this series, Europe paid it in full measure. Blanning's volume ends on a gloomy note, as far as the condition of life of the vast majority of Europeans was concerned, with the beginnings of industry and the effects of rapid population growth bringing a new kind of poverty, not a sudden affliction by famine, plague, or war, but a permanent state of malnutrition and underemployment. The 19th century, indeed, as this suggests, was relatively free of major European famines, plagues, and wars, and one task of this book will be to explain why. As in so many other aspects of this period, the changed relationship of Europe with the rest of the world was an important determining factor here. Famines there were, notably in Ireland, Scandinavia, and Russia, and plagues too, in the form of periodic outbreaks of cholera that swept the continent. But these too were neither so frequent nor so devastating as in some previous eras, and by the end of the century they had largely vanished from Europe. This did not mean, however, that social, economic, and other forms of inequality vanished along with them. Running through this book is the representation of the shifting contours of inequality in the 19th century, with its older forms, such as serfdom on the land, giving way to newer ones, such as wage labor in the factory. The 19th century can be seen as the age par excellence of emancipation, with millions of people being given greater equality of status, including, in key respects, the majority of the rural population, women, and religious minorities, notably the Jews. And this book will explore in detail these enormous changes and how they came about. But equality and emancipation were only ever partial and conditional, as the years after 1914 were to show, and describing the limitations people experienced in this process of liberation is also a central task for the historian of 19th century Europe. Arguments and disputes about inequality were at the center of 19th century European politics. Building on the legacy of ideas bequeathed by the French Revolution, increasing numbers of political thinkers and actors began to conceive and tried to implement ways and means of overcoming the inequalities they witnessed. The spectrum of solutions ranged from aristocratic paternalism and the sense of noblesse oblige at one extreme, to the anarchist attempt to destroy the state at the other. Socialism, liberalism, communism, nationalism, and many other doctrines prioritized one method or another of freeing people from the yoke of oppression and exploitation, according to how they defined it. Those who put stability and hierarchy first recognized they could not survive simply by clinging to the old order, or at least most of them did. And so they too became participants in the great debate on inequality. Religions offered a variety of answers to problems rooted in the temporal world, or advocated escape from it altogether. What all these many different strands of thought had in common was a desire to acquire and wield power so that they could put their ideas into action. Thus, while Tim Blanning calls his History of Europe from 1648 to 1815 the pursuit of glory, signifying the priorities of the dominant political elites of the age, this book has the title, The Pursuit of Power. The pursuit of power permeated European society in the 19th century. States grasped for world power. Governments reached out for imperial power. Armies built up their military power. Revolutionaries plotted to grab power. Political parties campaigned to come to power. Bankers and industrialists strove for economic power. Serfs and sharecroppers were gradually liberated from the arbitrary power exercised over them by landowning aristocrats. The central social process of the century, the emancipation of vast sections of the oppressed from the power of their oppressors, found its most widespread manifestation in the emancipation of women from their imprisonment in a nexus of laws, customs, and conventions that subordinated them to the power of men. Just as feminists fought for equality before the law, so too, in the new world of industry, labor unions went on strike for more power over wages and conditions of work. Modernist artists challenged the power of the academies, and novelists organized their work around struggles for power within the family and other social institutions. 19th century society increased its power over nature. Governments gained the power to avert or alleviate hunger and natural disasters, such as fires and floods. Medical researchers reached out in their laboratories for power over disease. Engineers and planners channeled rivers, drained marshes, drove out wild animals, and leveled forests. They built towns and cities, railway and sewer networks, ships and bridges, to extend humankind's power over the natural world. And, in a different sense, scientists and mechanics devised and exploited new sources of power, from steam to electricity, from the power loom to the internal combustion engine. Power could be formal or informal. It could be exercised through violence or persuasion. It could be consensual or majoritarian. It might take economic, social, cultural, political, religious, organizational, or a host of other forms. But as the 19th century progressed, people increasingly prioritized power over glory, honor, and comparable values that had been dominant through most centuries before 1815. By the end of the century, too, power was being reconceptualized in racial terms, as Europeans came to regard their hegemony over much of the rest of the world as evidence of their superiority over its inhabitants. How and why all this came to be, and how power relations within Europe affected and were affected by the rapidly changing power relations between Europe, Asia, Africa, and other parts of the globe, are the themes that stand at the center of this book. The book is divided into 8 chapters, each of which is subdivided into 10 sections. Chapters 1, 3, 7, and 8 deal primarily with political history. Chapters 2 and 4 with social and economic history, and chapters 5 and 6 with what might broadly be called Cultural history. The
Sample complete. Ready to continue?